Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Trump brags that billionaire pals made a killing after he pulled the plug on tariffs from independent.co.uk, and that was posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And if Trump wants to say that, he should, he says a lot of stupid stuff. But that being said, insider trading is at all levels of government, not just in the White House. I remember AOC, I think there was a post about her recently saying, when insider trading in the House of Representatives isn't good, but what about the White House? That's just the whataboutism. The people who don't like Trump and are accusing him of insider trading here usually are completely silent when Nancy Pelosi does it. But, because Nancy Pelosi has the correct letter next to her name from their point of view, but the orange man has the wrong letter next to his name, so it's the worst thing ever. And as I said, most of these podcasts, it's just who's in the in group, who's in the out group. There's not much more to politics than that these days. Then we have Republican-led U.S. House votes to limit judges' power to block Trump's agenda 219 to 213 from Reuters.com. And that's from CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Iron Front USA subreddit. And I personally don't think Trump should have absolute power, but ultimately, if his party wants to give him as much power it wants in the Congress, it should be able to. Personally, I don't really care for the courts, the executive branch, the judicial branch, or the legislative branch. They're supposed to hold each other in check, but ultimately, it doesn't really matter what each of them say. It matters how laws are enforced, and that's why if they want to justify or they want to justify, that's cool. But it doesn't really matter what they say. It matters how laws are ultimately enforced. That's why I think the people should pay more attention to the law enforcers than the lawmakers, because the law enforcers ultimately have more power and discretion to enforce the law however they feel like it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the Party of Free Speech, posted by Dapper Dame 89. That's a cross post from the Gen Z subreddit. That looks like a tweet from Joshua J. Friedman. Imagine trying to support someone for their expected beliefs. And that's the section, I think, on how they're trying to port that Mahmoud Khalil or something. It says under INA Section 273A4C2 for cases in which basis for discrimination is the alien's past, current, or expected beliefs, statements, or associations that are otherwise lawful. And I personally don't really care for that. I don't think people should be deported for their beliefs I personally don't think people should be deported at all, but some people are probably more justifiably to deport than others, like the gang members or the thugs and rapists and murderers. But with that being said, I find it interesting that this post is titled the Party of Free Speech, because the Republicans are really only the party of free speech at this point, because the Democrats are so anti-freedom of speech. They'll say, no, we're not. We're for free speech as long as it's not hate speech or misinformation. But the party can label any dissent at all as hate speech or misinformation, and ultimately, there's nothing you can do about that. So, I personally don't really care for how the Democrats are. Everyone's gonna be a little hypocritical on free speech, I would say, but I don't really care for how the Democrats say, "Oh, I'm for free speech as long as it's not hate speech or misinformation," or how the Republicans say, "Oh, I'm for free speech as long as it's not anti-Semitism." That's kind of runs into the same problem. Anything they don't like is going to be labeled as anti-Semitism, and so I personally think, we need to support free speech, but a lot of people are really hypocritical on it right now because they think the out group is the worst thing ever, but the in group is completely fine in regards to free speech, but they'll always be willing to make exceptions if the narrative says to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the last two sentences are ironic from Dapper Dame 89, and that's crosswords from the Leopards Ate My Face subreddit. An immigrant registered nurse votes for Trump because of endless wars and basically living in a fascist society. And that's Some post that that looks like some. Let's see. It says anonymous. I'm an immigrant to USA. Got my green card in 1985 and citizenship in 2010. I'm a registered nurse. No criminal record, no worry system. If ineligible to vote, I vote Democratic. I vote Democratic because I believe that the party aligns with my values: freedom of speech, social support network, individualism, and freedom for minorities, including gay people, etc. Support of unions, Medicare for all. When COVID happened, I saw a worldwide coordinated shutdown of people's freedoms, as well as obviously lying by public health organizations, CDC, FDA, etc. Then, when there was an active censorship and persecution of people who deviated from the state's position, when Biden forced people to take dangerous vaccines, I lost all faith in government and our current system of governance. I no longer trust the government and realize we have been lied to, propagandized, and used as pawns as to shovel wealth from workers up to elites, and we're basically living in a fascist society. Also, as a public health nurse myself, I saw a flood of immigrants brought into America illegally, all working for big corporations, all out in the open with tax IDs, SSNs, etc., for less than these companies would have to pay an American. I realized it was all a massive setup to keep the working people down and keep the elites wealthy and in charge. So after having voted for Obama and Biden, when I was eligible to vote, I looked for an alternative. I didn't like Trump, but I listened to his message of ending wars, stopping the flood of illegal immigrants, so companies will be forced to hire and pay Americans decent wages, stop censorship on social media, stop forcing garbage on us, etc. When RFK Jr. joined his administration, promising to make food and pharmaceutical companies adhere to healthy standards and challenge vaccine mandates, etc. I was really happy. Tulsi Gabbard, who seemed to stand for peace, and Castro, who said he would root out the deep state corruption in the FBI, all of this convinced me to vote for Trump. Fortunately, they have all betrayed us. Trump is nothing more than a servant to Israel, spending our tax dollars on a genocide so Israel can take over Palestinian lands, and even worse, can destroy what's left of Syria, bomb Lebanon, and probably invade Iran, so also Israel can complete its greater Israel dreams. Trump of all in his administration are Israel first, not America first. The Signal conversation showed Tulsi Gabbard and Shady Vance have lost their humanity, if they had ever had any, killing all those people and fist bumping about it online, so obviously it's absolutely disgusting. Trump turned out not to be for peace. He is once again friendless wars. His Doge stuff won't only nibbled away at a few cultural things that has irritated people, but of course he isn't going to cut military spending. Because he is not a president of peace. Cashville and Pambani are hiding JFK and JFK and Epstein files, and not going after deep state corruption. RFK Jr. is focused on anti-Semitism as a health concern. They have all really disappointed and betrayed us. Foolish for believing anything could change. We need to further people who are actually for the people of America. This administration simply isn't it. And I would agree with most of that. I personally never voted for Donald Trump, but I agree that, COVID really woke me up, was one of the really big things that woke me up along with the Epstein thing. I used to be kind of like them, a kind of a blue NPC shitlib who always voted Democratic. But, I agree with a lot of it, but you can't trust, just because Trump might market himself as being better than the Democrats on issues like stopping the wars or supporting free speech doesn't mean he actually is. I would agree with that point very much. And it just goes to show you how, the two parties always seem to be like they're on at each other's throats, but they're pretty much going to govern the exact same way, despite what partisans may have you believe. And I definitely would agree with that. Those last two sentences. We need a third party who are actually for the people of America. This administration simply isn't it. But the thing right now is 40% of people are going to vote Republican no matter what, and 40% of people are going to vote Democrat no matter what. Maybe for decent reasons like lesser of two evils, but you gotta always remember the lesser of two evils is still an evil, and you always gotta stand up against authoritarianism, I would say, even if you agree with them more than the other authoritarians and a branch of the Uniparty. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the cost of a woman's vote from CH4Locks, and that's crosswords from the Woman in News subreddit, and it's it looks like kind of a meme or infographic. Cost of democracy, what it takes for a woman to ensure their vote counts. Cost of passport, $165. Save Act because mismatched names threaten democracy. What cost to change your maiden name back to your maiden name? It's the states all. Yeah. And personally, this is just more DNC propaganda gobbledygook, I think. Married women as a whole are a lean Republican voting bloc these days. So they're not going to make it harder for them to vote, I would think. And the thing is that, Reddit, they think making it harder to vote in any way, shape, or form is fascism. But if it were up to Reddit, you could just send in infinite votes as long as it's for the Democrats. So a lot of people think they have their very principle when it comes to democracy. I personally am very anti-democracy. I would say democracy is simply forced collectivism and tyranny of the majority. that's why I think we got to have voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism. So yeah, if you want to be against the Save Act because it's gonna you think it's some kind of like a voter ID, that's fine. But don't pretend you're against it because for any principled position you're against it because the narrative simply says to be, because you want everyone to everyone to vote for the Dems, and you want all the votes to be pretty much untraceable, so you can't prove that you rigged it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have fire at Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's residence was an act of arson, police say, from NPR.org, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added not cool. And I would agree with that. I think they're kind of sweeping the story under the rug currently, because when he was one of the sitting governor's residence gets fired on, you think it would be a top story, but I don't think it's been as prominent as I thought it would be. And yeah, and I don't know what the reason for that is. I think I've had some theories, but yeah, they tried to even create a Wikipedia page for it, and they say, oh, you can't do that because it doesn't have sustained coverage. And I think my theory is it's because the guy who did it was a member of the in group rather than the out group. He seems to be more on the pro-Palestine left side than the pro-Israel right side. And yeah, but that's social media for you. It's always going to be, if something like this ever happens, it's always going to be either the out group or a false flag. And I guess I could see it being a false flag as well. Shapiro might be wanting to gain some sympathy for his 2028 run, and some old-fashioned Jewish lightning, as they say, might be a good way to do that. But yeah, I personally don't think. I think they definitely are trying to suppress the story because Reddit says, oh, the guy had anti-Joe Biden posts, even though if you're anti-establishment, you should have had an anti-Joe Biden post. Reddit thinks if you disagree with the official DNC narrative once, you're alt-right at this point. So yeah, it used to be quite an anti-establishment platform, but now it's all just whatever the DNC says. So yeah, and I think they're going to sweep this under the rug. It's going to be forgotten about because ultimately, I'm going to go with, I do think, it could have been a false flag, but I do think, if the guy they're accusing is guilty, it can be swept under the rug for the guy being a member of the in-group rather than the out-group. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have more assaults on American citizens' net worth and the free trade on the way, declares the Naked Emperor. And from CH Relax, and that's crosswords from the stock subreddit. Tariffs are back on, Trump says. And I personally don't care for tariffs. They're kind of dominating the news cycle currently. Eventually, people will move on to something else. But yeah, I don't really care for tariffs. They're a tax on imported goods. But with that being said, if Trump was still a Democrat, Reddit would love them. And it's the same when Joe Biden endorsed tariffs on China during his term. Back during Trump's first term, he started the trade with China, and Reddit hated it. Then, Joe Biden took over and pretty much continued those policies, and Reddit was either neutral or liked it. And now Trump's back with the trade war with China, and suddenly it's the worst thing ever again. It's most people don't have values, only teams. That's very much U.S. politics. And we have President Trump says CBS and 60 Minutes should pay a big price for going after him, from APnews.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. That's crosspost from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think. I think CBS and 60 Minutes are biased against Trump. I would agree with that, but I don't think they should have to pay a price. If you got support freedom of speech, Trump going after CBS and 60 Minutes is only going to serve to make him look bad in the eyes of the blue NPCs of Reddit. So ultimately, I think the Libertarian solution here is just let CBS and 60 Minutes become irrelevant like they should be. And rather than say, oh, they need to pay a big price for going after me. And that's my thoughts there. Then we have how polling exposes their authoritarianism, from CH Relax, and that's crosspost from the Blue Sky Skeets subreddit, and that's a Blue Sky post from Mark Shadborn. More and no other people. New poll: America would be better off if more people worked in manufacturing. 80% of Americans agree, 20% disagree. I would be better off when I worked in a factory. 25% of Americans agree, 70% of Americans disagree. 2% currently work in a factory. And yeah, this is just another Orange Man bad post, but yeah, if Trump, I personally do think if they want to bring factories back, they should be able to. But I personally wouldn't want to work in one. It's just it might just end up being like a sweatshop. But ultimately, I do think the collapse of American manufacturing through things like NAFTA is probably one of the big reasons for a lot of political toxicity we see today in the United States, because we used to be primarily manufacturer economy, now we're primarily service-based economy. I think that's just, it's the transition has been hard for a lot of people. I do think, it should be easy. I do think, if factories do want to build here because of the tariffs, I think that would be good. But as I said earlier, I personally think, even if the tariffs do have good results, I still personally wouldn't care for them, because, they're taxing imported goods, and I think all taxation is inherently a form of theft. So that's my thoughts there. And let's see if there's anything. Looks like there's nothing new, so we're gonna wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.